So good evening, everybody. I know there are a few people that are still coming in, but we are going to start the formal part of the program because, as you've probably already noticed, this is being recorded and it will be transmitted through the local TV station. So we actually have to stay within our time, which is between 7 and 8 p.m. So we are starting promptly, and I will finish the formal part of the program at 8 p.m. sharp. But if there are any questions that remain after that, I'm sure Michael will be very happy to answer them, and we can engage in more informal conversation after that. My name is Paqui Paredes. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Western, and this is the Dean's Lecture Series. Every quarter, we have one of our professors in the college give a talk about a topic that we believe will be a possibility and the ability for the community to enrich themselves and create that bond between the Bellingham community and the Western community, which I see is happening here today. I see a lot of students, I see a lot of faculty, and I also see people from the community. So welcome, everybody. This lecture series has been happening for many years. It's a collaboration between the college and the city of Bellingham. And with that, I want to thank the city of Bellingham employees that are helping us today to make this happen. And they're here after hours to ensure that the TV recording happens okay and that we have all the help that we need. I also want to thank Susanna Glatz, who's the administration assistant in the college, who made all of this happen, from reserving the space to communicating with all of you about what was happening today. So Susanna, I know you're out there somewhere. Thank you. So some of you may be regulars in the series, and some of you are probably new. This is a series that was initiated with the desire to give back to our Bellingham community. Our intention is to showcase in different ways, the different ways in which the study of the humanities and the social sciences, and particularly the scholarly work and the research that is undertaken by the faculty in our college, can help us better understand the world we live in, its past and present, and help us find solutions to some of the challenges and problems our world and our society face. And today's talk is a perfect example of that. Today's lecture is a great example of this. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Michael Wolff. Dr. Wolff is an assistant professor, now officially associate professor at Western Washington. Yes. At Western Washington's University Department of Political Science, Dr. Wolff teaches a variety of classes pertaining to political struggle and social order in the developing world. His research is focused on Latin America, particularly Brazil, Guatemala, and Mexico, where he explores the intersections between licit and illicit coercive power, examining the ways in which policymakers, state security agencies, and criminal groups shape one another's behavior regarding the use of violence. His most recent research has taken him to Mexico and Guatemala to study the behavior of vigilante groups as they contest the territorial claims of both drug cartels and the state. He has published widely and in such scholarly journals as Latin American Politics and Society, Policing and Society, Urban Geography, and Politics and Policy. His talk today is titled Vigilante Rebellion and Fragmented Sovereignty in Mexico. And with that, Michael, the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This is the first time I've been in this room, and I'm very excited about it. And thank you, Paqui. Thank you, Susanna, for organizing this. I want to express a cautionary note about perceptions before I start this talk, because it is going to be about bloody violence and state breakdown. Now, I'm not going to show photos of bloodiness, but the cautionary tale about perceptions has to do with the way we view other places. Now, 3 years ago now, in 2017, a think tank in the UK called the International Institute for Strategic Studies released a report in which it cited Mexico as the second deadliest country in the world after Syria. This is the height of the Syrian war. The methodology of that report was complete bogus. However, within a day, scores of media across the world had reported that Mexico is the second deadliest country in the world. That became a big talking point on a few different news media outlets here in the United States, and it even affected our political stance in reference to Mexico. And most of all, it portrayed, for many people who aren't familiar with Mexico, an image of complete chaos and pandemonium that's tantamount to some of the worst civil wars we've seen in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I mentioned that because this talk, I also focus on, in some ways, the worst of what's going on in Mexico, but in no way is Mexico a country or a place or a society that should be avoided. It's a beautiful country, and what I'm showing is not what you would typically experience if you were to travel there. I think it's a relatively safe place to travel, and I recommend that you do so. So with that said, I want to get into the chaos and pandemonium right away. So in 2018, I was conducting field research in the state of Michoacán. That's in the dark shadow right there. And about 2 months into the research, one of my contacts, a member of a vigilante group in the town of Nuevo San Juan, Paringaricutiro, which is outlined in the secondary shadow, he contacted me and he wrote the following. Now, a loose translation of this from Spanish to English basically says, Miguel, that's usually how I go by. He says, something's happening here in San Juan. Have you heard? And I say, no, I hadn't heard. What is going on, I ask. And he says, we've taken the city hall, and we've taken the mayor and the councilman hostage. And there's some excitement in the text. I'm not going to show you the rest of it, but I also got excited about it because this is what I was studying. It's like vigilante insurgency in action. I'll explain why it's vigilantism in a second. So I get in my car, drive a couple hours, and I get there. And what I find out is that they've shut down the entire town. You can't get in with a vehicle. So I park my car at the edge of town, and I walk in, find a ride who takes me down to the plaza where I get to see City Hall. And well, this scene right here is what's happening, right? There's a bunch of bonfires set up right in front. There's protest signs hung on the City Hall itself. And there's probably about 200-300 people, men, women, and children hanging out there. They're putting up schedules on the city wall to organize volunteer staffing of their protest. And basically the idea is that they're going to hold the mayor and the councilman hostage until the state governor pays attention to them. Now, what do they want? Well, about 2 weeks before this happened, 3 local men, ages 20, 21 years old, were kidnapped. And it was suspected that they were kidnapped by a regional cartel. And people wanted to pressure the state government into actually allocating the resources necessary to find the 3 men. And for the last 2 weeks, the state hadn't even mentioned it in their communications. Now, unfortunately for this group and for this effort that they were making, the state opted to completely ignore it. And it was partly able to do that because no journalists came there to check out the situation either. No police came, no military came, and the state just waited it out. The poor mayor got stuck there for almost a month. I had to go back to the US, but I kept in contact with the guys down there. And they reported that this happened in early August. They did not release the mayor until September 3rd or September 4th. Now much than he was before and a bit traumatized. Meanwhile, the 3 young men that were disappeared, they never appeared again to this day. So they're gone. The effort didn't work. Now you may be wondering, since we don't usually do that here to our mayor in Bellingham when we want something, why did they think of it? Well, one of the reasons is their first desire was to actually get 1,000 armed guys together and rush over to the town where they suspected the 3 men were being held. The problem is there's 2 vigilante groups in this town, and they couldn't agree on which town the guy was being held. And so they're about to start a major war without having the intel to do it. So this was the second option. On the other hand, there was good precedent for this. I'll talk about the precedents now. Some years earlier, in April 2011, in a nearby town called Cherán, an indigenous town, a culturally homogenous Purépecha indigenous town, was experiencing, for the last several years, an extortionist regime of a timber mafia. And the timber mafia was extorting the people, but they're also clear-cutting the tribe's communally held forest lands. In order to achieve this scheme, they had bought off the mayor and some other politicians, and anyone who had resisted, they had killed. So in a period of 2 years prior to 2011, this timber mafia had murdered about 28 people in this town, causing some serious trauma. But on one cold Sunday morning, around 6 a.m., some women from this town decided to stand right in front of a column of timber trucks coming down from the mountain. Soon somebody started ringing church bells. That was the alarm. Hundreds of people then descended down on this column of blocked timber trucks. They pulled the drivers from the cabs. They beat the living hell out of them. They doused the cars, the vehicles with gasoline, and they burned them. Over the next few days, they then went to war with the timber cartel. Several people died in this fight. But they won. They kicked out the timber cartel. More than that, they maintained mass protest for the better part of a year that finally forced the federal government to negotiate a deal in which they could institutionalize a state of political semi-autonomy. And on top of that, the federalist government agreed to give them money to subsidize a community police force with their own town. Now, this was so successful in part because of the political achievement, but also because they never had another murder again or another case of extortion until this day. So it's a very peaceful place to go. I spent a few days there, and it was fantastic. Now, because of that success, a couple of years later, in another town, about 150 miles away, in a region known as Tierra Caliente, hot lands, some cattle ranchers and some lime growers, they got together. They were upset about a cartel called the Knights Templar extorting their cattle, extorting their limes, and kidnapping people on a regular basis. So they decided to get some guns. Again, on a Sunday morning, they walked into their plaza. They waited for people to walk out of church, and when the people did get out of church, they rallied around and said, we got the numbers. We can kick the Knights Templar out of our town. And they did. A few big battles ensued, and lots of people got killed. But the movement was so successful, so popular, that it drew in as many as 20,000 armed civilian recruits over the next several months. And as they did, they ended up expanding. They went on the attack. And by the end of 2013, they controlled half of Michoacan's territory. As you can see up here in this map of all of Mexico, that higher blotch is Michoacan. And then you had a similar movement in the state just south of there called Guerrero that was sort of more in line with the experiment in Cherán, a lot of indigenous communities that were also seeking political autonomy. Now, this movement right here, it's known as the autodefensa movement or self-defense movement. They were extremely successful at first. However, they started to implode by about the middle of 2014. Implode in the sense that there was several different groups. It was a decentralized authority structure. People didn't trust each other. They ended up fighting, and the whole show fell apart. It left a transformed landscape. Michoacan today is really interesting architecturally, because as you drive through the state, what you see in town after town, in grove after grove of whatever is being cultivated, you see barricades, some primitive like the one on the left, sandbags, or some that are more like fortified bunkers replete with rifle parapets that are built to withstand RPG shells. Some of them are advanced. You can see on the left, this is in Nuevo San Juan. They're still building them today. We see new groups emerging every so often. We see old groups that have fallen apart, and then we see a few groups that have lasted. They've stood this test of time. Most of them are still manned. This on the left is a picture of the community of Charan. They're no longer a vigilante group by any means because now they are legalized. They represent a professionalized police force, and they represent a deal of stability. Much more common is this vision on the right. This is a bunker, if you will, in Nuevo San Juan. A hodgepodge of weapons, a non-professional force, a volunteer force that generally isn't paid for any of the stuff they do. Now, before I get to the next slide, I want to get to the roots of this, right? I want to understand what is causing all of this. You know, vigilante insurgencies, what they're responding to, obviously extortionists, drug cartels, and all sorts of horrors. But where are the roots of this? Now, the roots of this conflict in Mexico are definitely more complicated than one certain thing. However, it helps to focus and go back a few decades to see what really got the ball rolling. As you'll see, it's sort of a resource curse, a blessing and a curse at the same time. I'll trace it back for our purposes here to NAFTA. 1993, NAFTA is signed. January 1st, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement goes into effect, and its immediate effect upon Mexico is complete devastation. Why? Because an enormous amount of extremely cheap corn produced in the United States inundates the Mexican market. Millions upon millions of Mexican peasants who are dependent on small-scale corn production suddenly go into debt and they lose their land. The next year, in 1995, Mexico's peso, their currency, collapses. They call it the peso crisis. So the government, in this context, isn't able to help the poor out. So what do the poor do? They flee. We have millions of Mexicans migrate to the United States during the mid to the late 1990s because of this major economic transformation in Mexico. And the state that is hit absolutely hardest is Michoacan, because there's no industry there, and it's extremely rural, extremely poor. About 1.5 million people leave Michoacan between 1995 and 2000. And by 2000, there are more people living in the United States from Michoacan than who are still in Michoacan. That's 13% of all Mexican migration to the US during this period. For those who remain, in order to survive without the safety net provided by the state, we have to survive somehow. We see the emergence in this era of the first modern Mexican drug cartels. And in the state of Michoacan, a family whose name is Valencia, who basically takes charge of things. They buy up all of this very cheap land from all the peasants who are fleeing, and they use it to grow cannabis and poppy for heroin to satisfy demands in the United States. But interestingly enough, as we'll find out, this family Valencia were also avocado farmers. And they knew that while Mexican avocados were banned in the United States from 1914 to 1994, NAFTA represented a potential windfall of cash in the near future, as long as they had patience. I don't think anybody can see the numbers on this graph on the left. It represents a few different things. Avocado production in the United States is in green, and the blue is going to be avocado consumption in the United States, and the yellow is imports of avocados from other countries. The numbers down here start with 1980. In just around 1995, so a year after NAFTA, we see a slight increase in both consumption of avocados in the United States and of imports of avocados from elsewhere. Now, during this whole time, from 1980, and the chart ends in 2018, production of avocados, which is concentrated primarily in California, stays about the same. But demand goes from people, normal American in 1990 is going to eat 1 pound of avocados per year. And then in 2018, he's going to eat 8 pounds of avocados per year. I myself eat 20 pounds of avocados a year. And what this graph on the right shows is that before NAFTA, all of our avocados basically came from the United States. The second part shows 2015 to 2017 average, and here we see that a full, if you calculated that out, a full 90% of all avocado consumption in the United States comes from Mexico, right? Mexico, in fact, is now controlling about a third of the entire avocado market in the entire world. The Chinese eat lots of avocados now. The Australians eat lots of avocados now. It's a big thing. Now, here we see that a full 93% of that production in Mexico is concentrated in what was the poorest state in all of Mexico. That's Michoacán. If you calculate this, Mexico is now producing about 2 million metric tons. That's about 4.4 billion pounds of avocados, the majority of which is produced in just a very small region right over here. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. In Michoacán alone, avocados are now producing about $1 billion per year. And I'll explain why that's important in just a minute. So let's go back to the world of crime and violence. In 1990, the Valencia family, as I mentioned, they were growing cannabis, they were growing poppy for heroin. But they were also investing heavily in avocado trees. Avocado trees take about 7 to 10 years to ripen for the fruits to be ready for the market. So they're planting trees all throughout the 1990s. And then in 2007, you see something happen. A new president is elected named Felipe Calderón in Mexico. And he promises to throw the full weight of the Mexican military against the cartel system. And he's going to start this war on the cartels in his home state of Michoacán. At this point, we already see that the Valencia family has sort of fractured into two different new cartels, La Familia Michoacana and Los Zetas. But they're already fighting with each other and throwing some heads around. In 2007, the military comes in, and they come in hard and heavy with 10,000 troops. 2 years later, the government's going to send another 10,000 troops. This puts a lot of pressure on the cartels. So what happens when the military is thrown at a problem like this? Well, the first order of things is that the cartel is going to need to decentralize its operations. It's going to need to hire a lot more people, soldiers, but also lookouts, and it's going to have to pay a whole lot more money in bribes to keep the government off their back. The government, meanwhile, needs to show that it is fighting the drug war effectively, so it needs to confiscate lots of shipments of drugs and arms, and so you're going to lose profits in the actual trafficking of drugs. So at this point, La Familia Michoacana starts to heavily invest in an extortion regime that targets the avocados. So by 2007, we start to see a dramatic increase in avocado money in Michoacán. Now those fruits are ripe, and now 2007, incidentally, is also the year when the last of the American states has resisted any type of avocado blockade. So even California has to accept Mexican avocados at this point. So we have a lot of money right at a time when the drug cartel is investing heavily in extorting that market. So by 2007, 2008, we can expect La Familia Michoacana to be extracting about $100 to $150 million per year just on the avocado industry alone. This is not to speak of methamphetamines, it's not to speak of the mining industry and various other industries that can be extracted from. And they're using that money, as I said, to wage war and to buy off the army, or at least units of the army and units of the federal police who are cracking down on them. The cartel system continues to split. Late 2010, La Familia Michoacana falls apart, and we see the emergence of the Knights Templar cartel. We also see the emergence, or I should say the encroachment, of a cartel from a neighboring state called Jalisco. The war gets so bad, the need for money among these decentralizing cartels becomes so great that they start not only extorting the markets, but they start kidnapping rich people and poor people alike to make more and more money. By 2011, the situation gets terrible enough in Cherán for that community to rise up. By 2013, it's even worse. And that's when we see the autodefensas rise up. And again, as I mentioned earlier, they were very popular at first. People were so fed up with the cartel regimes that they joined that march in the thousands. However, it didn't work out as wonderfully as everybody would have hoped. The autodefenses themselves split up in several groups and started fighting each other. And then Knights Templar also split up into several groups, started fighting each other. And now you have a situation of what seems like utter chaos, fragmented sovereignty, which each little territorial enclave is owned and run by a different armed group, some of which are more legitimate than others, but all of which are fighting for their own turf and not for a grander project of political, social, or economic stability. Ultimately, we get seen in Michoacan like this. The color coding is such that red represents a municipality where there are 5 or more criminal organizations contesting that territory. White is where there are none, right? So the state is broken up into control zones of different cartels or self-defense groups, and where you see the red, the orange, and yellow, that is typically where we're going to see the greatest amount of lethal violence, the highest amount of extortion, kidnapping, and that continues on today. In fact, 2019 was one of the most violent years on record in Michoacan, more violent than it was during the height of the wars between the Knights Templar and the state prior to the autodefensas. Now, this leaves us with a problem. Obviously, the state has been incapable so far of ensuring a monopoly on the legitimate use of force and protecting its own population, as we would hope from a centralized state. So there is the option of self-defense, and in some cases it works really well. But I've identified 3 basic models. The first on the left is what I've already talked about, what we see in Cherán, that culturally homogeneous indigenous community that achieved political autonomy in a self-policing regime that is subsidized by the federal government. This works absolutely wonderful. It's a great system. You feel safe there. Nobody's getting killed. Nobody's getting extorted. However, legally, and also in terms of, I think, informal collective action regimes, this model is not available to non-culturally homogeneous indigenous communities. The government doesn't allow the same thing for non-indigenous or what we would call mestizo communities in Mexico. Now, for those communities, there's also another decent option. In the town of Tancítaro, sort of the capital of avocado production in Michoacán, we have a privately funded professional police force that is supported by an auxiliary voluntary vigilante force. The professional police force is paid for by the Avocado Growers Association. There you have a small number of very wealthy landlords who have agreed to throw in a bunch of their money to pay for this professional police force. And if anything, like any emergencies come to head, like the invasion of a cartel, for example, you have a couple of thousand civilians under arms with walkie-talkies who will jump out of their houses like Minutemen to deal with the threat. They've maintained a relatively stable situation in Tancítaro since 2013, and you also feel very safe walking around in this town. There's order, there's stability, there's peace, and there's some prosperity as well. However, you need a lot of prosperity. You need a relatively small number of people to get along to make this happen. That's not a common thing in Michoacán. So this third option is what we see more often, but it's also the least stable. In Nuevo San Juan, you have lots of small avocado growers. They have small plots of land, thousands of them, right? They don't get along altogether. Nobody has enough money to pool the resources to create a professional unit. So what they have done instead is create sort of an ad hoc volunteer type of vigilantism, where you see periodic insurgent actions, like the one I described right at the beginning of class, but they also did that 6 months before that as well. And then they did that 2 years before that as well. And it does cause a lot of turmoil in the town and is potentially dangerous, because if you remember, I mentioned their first plan of action in response to those 3 kidnapped youths was to actually wage a war on the neighboring community. And one of those neighboring communities was Tancítaro. So you can imagine 1,500 armed guys attacking another town with 1,500 or 2,000 armed guys, that can look pretty ugly, pretty much like fragmented sovereignty. However, I don't want y'all going home tonight and thinking that it's all death and destitution in Michoacan. I think there's a big, important bright side to all of this. What I saw when I was down there, which in some ways was very beautiful, is that in a state that has never experienced a democratic revolution of any kind, you see for the first time people who have historically been excluded from the political process and who have felt generally fatalistic towards politics altogether are now becoming protagonists in historical and political change. People who are barely literate, who have not graduated the 3rd grade, are now actively organizing with the political class and becoming part of this. The benefit of this is in the future is that as we see the economy grow in Michoacan, it doesn't need to always or continue to always be a resource curse. The fact that you have a politically motivated population, even among the poor, means that perhaps in the future the people will be able to put the government in check and force it to become more responsive and more accountable for its complicity with the problems of organized crime and violence. So with that, I'll say thank you and open this up to questions.
Just as you talked about the 3 different types of auto-defense groups, just a couple of things. One, the concern with using vigilante, you didn't describe why, but it's kind of using similar to a pejorative word that you'd use, talking about underdeveloped people as savages. We don't talk about the Minutemen as vigilantes. They're our heroes. So the question of the Academy using a pejorative word rather than something that might not fit your academic criteria, but I think it's inappropriate. Then in terms of the criminalization of the Ladino, the mestizo auto-defense groups by the state, they did not have the opportunity, as the indigenous communities, as you mentioned, to develop without being criminalized and repressed by the state. So that in terms of the failure of the state to see the opportunity to work with the mestizo communities to provide for their own defense, the question of your comments about their inability to organize as small farmers, as cooperatives, because they didn't have a couple of billionaires to finance their professional police. The criminalization of these groups, I think, is really important in terms of one of the reasons why they were not successful, as they were hunted and criminalized by the state.
Well, should I use this or? You can use your own. Oh, okay. No, excellent questions. And with regards to the first one, so my use of vigilantism to refer these groups, I think, is somewhat problematic. I use it because the word vigilante itself, for a lot of people, has this negative connotation. It sounds pejorative. On the other hand, some people hear the word vigilante and it sounds like a very good thing. I use the word vigilante to refer to them because I'm trying to remove myself from this moral connotation and get to the very clear and simple idea that what they're doing is using violence in an extra legal way to prevent something that they see threatening their community. There are different words I can use, but it's very difficult to find a word that would not have some type of moral connotation, like self-defense group, right? Self-defense already automatically gives a positive connotation, but we know from self-defense groups all over Latin America that we have death squads who are calling themselves self-defense groups. And if I call them death squads, that would also create a different one. So for lack of a better word, I think I can call them civilian militias. That's one way forward. But I do like the word vigilante. Now, with respect to
What is about the word vigilante that you like?
Well, for me, I've always been drawn to the concept of vigilantism. But that doesn't mean I like all vigilantes, right? I think vigilantism can be absolutely horrible and it can be okay. But that's a conceptual thing. I understand. The other question is, I think, pragmatically speaking, a lot more complicated. The government did hunt down these autodefensas. And a lot of them were jailed unjustly. And when they were released from jail, a whole lot of them were gunned down by the cartels that were upset because they lost their territory because of them. On the other hand, the vigilantes themselves did form alliances, clear alliances with drug cartels who then put on the autodefensa t-shirts. They were the ones who were professionals in the art of violence, so they were very useful. And their material interests, drug trafficking, extortion, ended up infiltrating the larger cause of that group. I think the benefit that the indigenous communities had is that they were culturally homogenous, much more culturally isolated, and therefore were able to resist the type of criminal infiltration that you saw in the mestizo groups. So the government isn't innocent in this case, but it was also a complicated thing that speaks to problems of collective action, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. We ask that you use a microphone because it's being recorded so that people can hear you.
Thank you, Michael. I think my question is also related to the first one is, so you have these three autodefensas, right? And they do share the effort to exercise violence to protect communities. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, all of those three forms of self-defense have larger political efforts, right? So the indigenous groups, I assume, would actually like to have, beyond maintaining peace, they would actually have other political demands, and I would suspect drastically different from the second and the third, given that they actually come from private capital, rich people, right? So they are landowners, so there are different class interests, perhaps, or other interests that would actually play a different role on how they want to use violence in order to protect themselves and exert violence onto other groups. So what are those political demands for all those three self-defense?
So most of the groups that I ran into, they wanted what Chiran, the indigenous community, achieved. They wanted political autonomy too, but there wasn't a legal justification to get there. And so sometimes they would negotiate, but fatalistically knowing that they weren't going to get state subsidization, and they didn't have any ancestral traditions that they could use to substitute the Mexican political system. So they were stuck with trying to invent a new project out of nothing. And for the most part, they've not been able to do that except with the town of Tancitro, which is that situation that's paid for by the Avocado elite. But there's all this political element because local populations, they tend to be demanding autonomy. And they effectively achieve that in a de facto way because they put barricades up on their town. And if the federal police or the military come in, they can get 1,000 men, women, and children out the street at any minute to prevent any type of operation. But that's not the same as a legalized system of political autonomy. So I don't see that working out too well in the long run. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just kind of building off of that last question, I was curious if there's cases where you see these groups getting legal autonomy within the government, and if so, just what are the standards that the government uses to give those groups legal autonomy?
Well, as I mentioned, the group in Chiran, fully legalized and even state sanctioned. In some of the mestizo communities, in 2014, the state government agreed to legalize part of the self-defense forces. And so they turned them into what they called a rural police force. And they gave them uniforms and AR-15s and some pickup trucks. And they became technically part of the state police apparatus, but they are functionally separate. And you can see this because the state police paid the first few months of their salaries and they gave them one uniform and one gun and never did anything else. So now they're still wearing the badge of the state police. They functionally act like a private police protecting whatever remnants exist of whatever self-defense group still runs around that town. It's a difficult thing because the state doesn't have the political capital necessary to disarm them. And so they're kind of just waiting for them to die out as their uniforms get very, full of holes and whatnot. Yeah.
Has AMLO made any difference? Has there been a change in policy with the new regime in Mexico?
That is such a delicate question. We got there on the day that AMLO was elected, and there was euphoria in Mexico City. There was not euphoria in Michoacan. I think there was a feeling that in Michoacan, things were going to get worse. It was just going to be another rupturing of the system. And indeed, things have gotten worse in Michoacan as a result. And just a couple of months ago, you had a police column of state police of about 21 or 23 officers that got ambushed. And most of them were murdered right there. Nothing happened in response. So what you see in AMLO's administration right now in Michoacan is a relative strengthening of the cartel structure vis-a-vis the state. And I don't know if I can directly attribute AMLO's new policy to that, but it hasn't correlated with an improvement, unfortunately. Yeah. Oh.
Do you think the fact that there's only one gun store in Mexico that's legal and it's in the state, or it's in Mexico City, and so only the political or the wealthy have access to going to that store and becoming legally able to own a firearm? Do you think that plays into do you think that plays into how everybody sees these militant groups, because they are all technically illegal, because almost all their firearms are illegal, and therefore their whole operation is technically illegitimate? Do you think that impacts them in any way?
Well, I'm not sure what to say about that one weapons store in Mexico City. It's an interesting case. Mexico basically bans all firearms. And when you drive through a place like Michoacan, it's kind of a laughable ban, you see. Nobody has a legal weapon there. Often the police don't even have legal weapons. I don't know what to say about that, but it does create kind of a problem of legitimacy for these groups, right? Because they're starting off with the fact of illegal possession of firearms. But what the state has tried to do to ameliorate this is to post facto legalize some of the weapons they have. And they can do so as long as they're not technically military grade. But that's sort of a blurry line, because a lot of weapons you can buy at Walmart are just below military grade, but they do the same thing at the same distance. So yeah.
So I guess kind of playing off that question a little bit, the cartels obviously have the resources. The cartels and some of the wealthy landowners have the resources to acquire some of this kind of material that you need to wage, a resistance or essentially a war, an occupation. Were the autodefensas just self-sufficient, or was there kind of a tacit support from other people in the country, an army truck driving down the road, they accidentally lose a case of assault rifles on the they hit a bump and it flies
happens
out.
All the time,
yeah, happens all the time.
So you're talking about support, where do they get their money and their weapons, right? Excellent question. They kind of say under their breath typically that, well, the only way to get a weapon is to get it illegally. The people who monopolize the illicit market are cartels and organized crime groups themselves. And so there is, at least tacit informal alliances with cartels. And in some other cases, we've seen that rival cartels have actually funded and provided weapons for a civilian militia to fight their rival. And then you get this transition in the drug war itself from a group of easily classified criminal actors to a drug war that is carried out in large part by popular mobilization, by people who are not directly engaged in the legal activities of the drug war, but are now participating as fighters on the front lines. So, yeah. And then also people buy their own guns. Like they'll, you know, like a guy who owns like a small store in Avocado Grove, he's gonna like spend a little bit of extra income to buy some type of weapon. Yeah.
Do you see any leadership coming forward that might unite some of these disparate vigilantes?
So, you know, there's one guy down there who was sort of the symbolic figurehead of the autodefensa movement back in 2013. His name was Jose Manuel Mireles. They call him Dr. Mireles. And I interviewed him on a number of occasions. He had in his head that he was going to unify a self-defense movement all around the country, then use that as a platform to run for the presidency. And he was, I think, very popular around the state. So popular that when I would mention that, you know, we were buds, vigilantes would open their doors to me automatically and want to share information. On the other hand, he's got some legitimacy problems himself, and it looks like he might have some other issues that would prevent him from achieving that. So I don't know. I don't know anybody else who could achieve that at this point, but there may be some future figures that rise up. Yeah. Oh. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I just had two quick questions. One, I'm really curious about the role of women in these autodefensa groups. And then I'm also interested in the role of professionalism. Is there a sense in which the autodefensist groups want to become professionals, or is there a kind of benefit, whether that's a political benefit or a ethical benefit, to being more vigilante and more of the people in a non-professional way?
So for the first question, it's one of my favorite questions, my favorite issue areas that for me has been a little bit hard to get to, because in an environment like this, the men usually pull a man like me aside and talk to them, and I don't get to see what the women are doing. But my wife and my child did travel with me for about half of this trip, and I was fortunate enough to be in a situation where the women would pull my wife aside and tell her their side of the story. And what we mostly see is that in addition to being probably even more affected by this violence than the men, the women play very active support roles. Partly for propaganda purposes, but they also play just the organizational roles, the food provision, the healthcare provision. They're very much active in all of this, although you will see very few women actually carrying weapons. Occasionally you do. The difference will be in the indigenous communities. You see a lot more female engagement with the actual policing part. Now, the second question is also really interesting, because on one hand, if you legalize, you establish institutional permanence and stability. That sounds great. However, if you do that, you wrap yourself up into the constraints of a national constitutional system that protects individual rights. What does that mean? That means you can't go around beating heads all the time. And this is important because a lot of the frustrations that people feel in these communities are the fact that there's a drug addict always hanging out right outside their house, breaking their windows, not letting them sleep, threatening their life, and every time he gets arrested, he's released the next day. And they find it much more effective to just beat him very badly, tie him to a pole, maybe burn him alive if necessary, but they get to do that as long as they don't become legalized. Once you legalize, you become less effective in the short run, although much more stable and effective in the long run. So it's a weird trade-off, and I think the emerging groups definitely battle with this. They battle with each other over the best way to move forward, for sure.
When you were talking about that, the one leader of the autodefensas group, and you said they had gotten in, there were some reasons that they were not going to be a viable candidate to kind of unite the groups and maybe even lead some parts of Mexico. What were those kinds of limitations? Like, why would he face limitations in like unifying those groups?
Well, part of the reason is that he was accused on multiple occasions of working for a particular cartel. And then there were other groups that were more affiliated with other cartels. So that was one difficulty in unifying everybody in Michoacan. But he had also been really ridiculed in the national media at some point. I mean, he said he's a gaffer. He made lots of problematic gaffes that made it look like he wasn't all there all the time. His ego seemed to grow outsized at times. And so what I noticed is outside of Michoacan, people didn't look at him as a viable presidential candidate. I mean, people kind of, for lack of a better word, I mean, they laughed at him in some ways. But at the same time, he was extremely popular within Michoacan itself.
Michael, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned before that a lot of the organization for these movements that grew up in Michoacan came from indigenous structures that preceded that. And I'm wondering, because in places like Tupátaro, Sirawen, Sinsunsan, areas like that, you've always had very strong indigenous concilios that kind of manage the ejido systems in those areas. And I'm wondering, what is the interactivity between those older concilios and the ejido system? Is there any interactivity with the vigilantes at this moment, or the autodefensa squads at this moment? And do you see any type of membership that kind of crosses those types of lines?
To some extent, yeah. So I mean, in a place like Cherán, this picture is actually taken in Cherán. Their like managing system, concilio, is that you refer to it as? It had been thoroughly corrupted before 2011, and the people who were corrupted within it were driven out of the city. And now it's a much better monitored system that seems to be relatively free of corruption. But in other towns, like Nuevo San Juan, here you have also ejido lands and communal forest lands, but only 30% of the population is indigenous. And it's been a lot more difficult in those places to clean out the corruption within the management of communal lands. And here you get vigilantes in some cases acting like drug cartels and taking advantage of its vulnerability. So in those community lands, for example, we were taken to a meth lab up in the communal forest. In the community to which that ejido belonged really didn't have much of a say because its management organization was complicit in this. So yeah, there's some interaction.
Looks like we're all set.
Michael, I'm wondering, it certainly looks like you have a lot of access to these groups. And I'm wondering, how does a scholar from the US get access to interview, become close with these groups?
So my field method of trying to get access into difficult places evolves constantly over time. In this particular trip, it worked out really wonderfully. I go to Morelia, the capital. It's really hard to make contacts before you go to a place like this because everything is ruled by informality. And these groups don't have like internet websites too often. They might have Facebook accounts, but it's hard to like get in touch with them. So you pretty much have to go. And I was fortunate enough to strike a meeting with the Dr. Mireles, who I'd mentioned earlier, and he helped me open up a whole world. And in some cases, I was able to make contacts directly through him. In other cases, I couldn't, but I'd simply drive into a community where I knew there had been an uprising, and I'd have a name that I could ask for. And so I'd stop, in front of a group of armed guys and say, "Hey, I'm here to talk to Felipe." And there'd be a little bit of, who are you? What's going on? And I usually tell the absolute truth. I'm a professor in the United States. I'm doing a study on citizen resistance to organized crime. That's probably a better way for me to actually put this to, get rid of the pejorative idea. Yeah, and people open up. I mean, not always easily. In one case, I felt like I broke the ice because a couple musicians walked by, and I asked to play their guitar, and I knew this one song from the band Calibre 50, which is the best banda music you can ever listen to in Mexico, and the whole street started singing. And at that point, nobody could say no to me, so, but I can't put that down in a book of methods of how to grant access. Calibre 50 isn't popular everywhere, so it works out.
I can envision that. All right, so it's almost 8, and it's the perfect time to close down the formal part of the program. You're welcome to come up and say hi to Michael. Michael, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I really appreciate you coming and giving this talk, and I appreciate you all coming and being so engaged with the questions at the end. I'm going to take an opportunity to let you know what our next Dean's Lecture Series is going to be, which is going to be in the spring, May 1st. And Professor Carolyn Nielsen from the Department of Journalism will be presenting Whose Truth? Journalism, Democracy, and the Digital Era. And with that, thank you so much. Please feel free to come up and say hi.
Thank you. Thank you.